Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, and as you can see, we have some very smart people with me today. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to listen to it on demand. After today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time today you have a question for any of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes near the end of today's presentation to go over the audience questions. And we are doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards, and that will be happening today at the end of the webinar. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 3 big winners. All right, with that, we'll kick off today's webinar, which is DevOps tools, DevSecOps tools worth knowing. That's a mouthful. Our speakers today are David Habusha, who is VP of Product at WhiteHorse. Hi, David.
Hi.
Dan Beauregard, who is VP Cloud and DevOps Evangelist at ZBO Labs. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Good. Hello. Glad to be here.
And we also have Cody Wood, who is the AppSec Product Support Engineer at Signal Sciences. Hey, Cody. How are you?
How's it going, everyone?
Great. Well, today's event I'm really excited about because, as you can see, we do have a whole lot of really smart people with me today. So there are their headshots there. But today's event is actually a discussion that is part of a conversation that we have been having around this State of DevOps Tools ebook that we put out. This is the 3rd in our series of webinars for the DevOps Tools ebook. And the book is actually available now on the DevOps.com website. You can download it there, but everybody who registered for today's event is also they've been sent a link, or you will be sent a link to access the ebook and download it for yourself. So with that, I kind of want to just kick off today's webinar by, first of all, asking each of our panelists to just tell us a little bit about yourself, give us a little bit of background on your experience, tell us a little bit about your company. And David, why don't you go ahead and kick us off, please?
Sure, happy to be here. David Habusha, VP of Product with WhiteHorse. We help companies develop better software by harnessing the power of open source. We're what's called a software composition analysis vendor. We allow organizations to maintain inventories of their open source components, to run policies and generate alerts based on these open source components. We also automate the detection and remediation of security vulnerabilities pertaining to open source and assist organizations with maintaining license compliance with open source.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure, no problem. So, Dan Beauregard, I'm a Cloud and DevOps Evangelist at ZBO Labs. My first part of my career, 12 plus years, I was in software development. And for the last 10 plus years, I've been working with organizations, working with companies, helping organizations move to the cloud. At ZBO Labs, we build intelligent enterprise scale release automation or release orchestration and deployment automation that helps organizations deliver code faster and with less risk.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. And Cody, last but not least. Tell us a little bit about
how's it going? Yeah, so I've been working in application security for about 5 or so years. Before that, I actually used to work in mining operations, not data mining or anything like that. So a little bit different background than I think this panel and a lot of people in information security as well. And currently I work for Signal Sciences. We're a web defense company, so we fit into the space of web application firewalls, next-gen web application firewalls, that kind of market segment. But where we really kind of differentiate ourselves is easy deployability. We don't disrupt velocity, and we're really, really good about helping anyone who's trying to go to production live with actual security in place. Our security tool is very production friendly. So I think those are the three key differentiators that we have versus, some of the other web application firewalls or people attacking the RASP or the NG-WAF market.
All right.
Thanks, Charlene.
Great, thank you. And so as you can see, we have a lot of experience here, lots of different and varied experience here. So feel free to throw your questions out to our panelists at any time during today's presentation. But let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar with this one fundamental question: is why should we care about DevSecOps? Why not just have DevOps without the sec? So I want to throw it out to you guys first and let you duke it out amongst yourselves. Whoever wants to start the conversation is fine.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start off.
Everybody wants to start.
At a high level, security dig down even deeper afterwards. But I think without question, security needs to be an integral part of DevOps process. Organizations have struggled to deliver code faster while the ever changes in security and compliance risks are out there. So, we're looking at the only way that organizations can really control is to move security earlier in the release process. It's kind of that shift left. It's the only way that allows them to deliver code fast, apps safe at the same time. I think there's a lot of data out there that's been used to prove this. If I reference the DORA report of 2018 on the state of DevOps, they put it as one of the most vital components with all the risks and threats that are out there in the space. So if I look at organizations that don't include security testing, risk assessments, compliance evaluations as part of their entire software delivery or release pipeline, they're really putting their organizations at risk, right? So it goes beyond just failed release or delay in getting a feature out to market. It could be introducing vulnerabilities into their production applications. They could be failing compliance and audit tests that could have both penalties and fines associated with it, really putting your organization at risk. If I was going to take a step back, I really think that security in DevOps is kind of part of the natural evolution of DevOps. DevOps, not a technology, right? It's really cultural organization shifts that organizations need to make. If we look at where DevOps, right, breaking down the barriers, and I think, we all know it started with developers and IT operations, and that's how we got the name DevOps. So if you look at what initially happened, those two organizations work together to build code better, breaking it down to smaller components and so forth. Once we got really good at that, then we kind of moved over to how could we better deploy. We moved on to the next constraint in the release pipeline. So we got really good at infrastructure as code and getting better at deploying to not just your private cloud, but your public clouds as well. And once we got better at that, the constraints moved on to testing. So we started to introduce automation testing into the release process. Then we went to continuous testing, which was really shifting testing earlier and earlier in the release process. And then after that, now we hit security, right? Security has always been the last step of that release process that we would get to right before we would throw our code into production. If there was a problem, it would delay the release process. It could be weeks, it could be months, until we really get this out into the market. So being able to take those release components, or security components, introduce them earlier in the process is the way to solve this. And it required more than just the organizational change of getting security to work with IT and developers, but it did have us reevaluate and come up with better technology to be able to introduce into our release pipelines. So my counterparts today are both companies that have developed this type of software. It makes it much easier for organizations to do that, and for my organization to be able to orchestrate it across the software delivery process.
All right, great. David or Cody, you guys want to kind of jump into the fray here and let us know why you guys think that we need to keep security farther left in the DevOps process.
Yeah, I can chime in. Dan, a great kind of history and a summary of like kind of where DevOps has come from. Like for me, kind of too long didn't read of that is basically like development came along and they applied software engineering methodologies to operations, and so it's more of a software-based approach. Infrastructure is code, but code is fundamental to all of it. And security people have traditionally been tool users, tool operators. Usually the really good security people eventually kind of do scripting and things like that, but there's very much this disassociation from like engineering and software engineering, and we were always there to criticize it. And it's much easier, as everyone knows, to break something than it is to build it. And as companies are getting velocity and everyone's a software company, they're all building things faster, quicker, and security is last in the pipeline because it doesn't inherently provide any business value other than risk reduction. And so on security side, we got left behind. I don't really think DevOps left us behind. Like we voluntarily stayed behind. I mean, talking to some of my security peers, we really thought this was a trend. This was just something like, oh, agile. It's like when we hear these terms from security looking outward, we become very jaded, I guess, towards that kind of stuff. And so security finally became part of it because I think people recognize it was a legitimate movement. It provides business value. We finally maybe realized that that's something we actually have to do, and like conveying and communicating risk reduction, that's all part of it. And doing it every part of that pipeline, whatever your software development cycle looks like, from waterfall to continuous integration, whatever you have in place, putting security in that as part of it, whether it's in name of the title and how we talk about it, I think that's more of a sort of gimme. Really, those cultures can come from words, but just sliding security in there, yeah, that's a start. But there's a lot behind that, and I think that's a way to summarize that movement. Is like we've either mastered or we're going to approach DevOps. How do we bring in security? How do we make it approachable for them? And then also on security side, how do we build tools that aren't built for just us? They're not built for just the security people. They're not built for them to consume. It should be, that's part of it, is we need to make it consumable for development across the board and automate as much as our job as we can.
All right.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything said, and these are definitely the fundamentals of the modern DevSecOps teams. I believe the fundamentals rely both on processes as well as in automation of DevSecOps. And when I'm saying processes, I mean that there's a big gap today between the security teams and the development teams and the DevOps teams, both in the way they think, in their mindsets. I mean, to be honest, and we ran such a survey, developers don't really like fixing security issues. The security teams, they detect the issues, they alert on these issues, but when it comes to communicating these issues and closing the loops on remediating them, it's a very hard task. And that's where they need the cooperation of the development teams. And when they have these processes in place, when they have a team like a DevSecOps that on one side understands how developers think and work, on the other hand, how the security teams work and communicate, and they automate this whole process, then that's the key to a successful relationship between the security teams and the development teams. And if you look at just the number of people in those teams, you will find hundreds or thousands of developers in an organization, while you will have probably a dozen or so DevOps people. and where you'll probably have 3 or 4 security people. So it can't work on any other way. I mean, you just have to automate, and you have to have the right tools in place to communicate and to close the loops on resolving application security issues. And that's why the DevSecOps teams, we see them all over the place right now. And actually, on our end, we see 2 trends which are very interesting. One, we see security teams who take developers and put them in the security teams for a year or 2, or even for a long time, to just teach them how developers work and how developers would want to see security issues communicated and resolved. And you help these DevSecOps teams very much by just changing their mindsets and adapting the processes in the development and working on that on the DevOps and security end. But on the other hand, we have some customers who actually took security analysts and put them in the dev teams to help developers improve the way they think about security and the way they develop their applications. So I'm just wondering, I mean, how it's going to look like in a few years, but definitely that's something that resolve the automation and the communications, and actually it bridges the gap and the friction between the dev teams and the security team. So you have to have these tools and processes in place.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting comment about how certain companies are embracing DevSecOps by bringing their developers into the security space and vice versa. And so I wonder if really that's indicative of a larger trend that's going to be happening in the space when we're talking about DevSecOps, and the idea that you can't kind of be your own island. You have to have a particular, at least, base of knowledge, developers in security and vice versa. And I wonder if our other panelists are seeing anything like that happening in the space as well. I mean, are you guys seeing, as far as market trends are concerned, among your customers, any sort of movement toward kind of better integration or learning, education, anything along those areas with your customers?
Yeah, I'll chime in here.
Sure.
David, great point about like kind of embedding security. I did just want to like tangentially mention that like that's what my title is a little bit confusing, AppSec product support engineer, but that's what we do at our company. Is we dog food our own application security product. So that's what I manage. I do the rules for all that. Then also I work on one of the product featured teams. So I'm in with software engineering. I'm in their meetings. I'm in roadmap planning. Like I'm very aware of like moving where possible issues that come up, and so it's very much an embedded sort of group in there. And I won't say I've seen that as a market movement or a trend or anything like that. I think that's something that companies aspire to be, but it is very difficult. We're a smaller startup. It's been a little bit easier to do things like that. One thing I do want to mention is kind of the serverless or functions as a service technologies. I've been noticing a lot more sort of trends towards that direction, and whatever that is, whether it's you're moving to microservices, you're using AWS's Lambdas to do things, I'm seeing more of this where it, from a security perspective, it kind of pushes me out. Like it's not as big an issue anymore when the instance that was running when a hacker got in lasts 60 seconds or something like that. So I'm seeing where more companies are saying, look, what if we just design security in better? What if we do these things earlier? And it's not really finding bugs and identifying them. It's just like, what if architecturally we make it very, very near impossible? So even if we did get exploited, even if we had to open remote code execution, like we could limit the impact to very minimal impact. And so how do we protect users like that, where we design systems that are just more inherently secure? So they're going to have their own issues and things like that. It's kind of always happens with security. But that's something I've seen more consideration too, is even reviving old ideas. Microservices isn't that new of an idea in general. But how do you revive something like that with new technologies, new ways that people look at products, new engineering resources? Like, how do we revive some of those like ideas that kind of sputtered out over the last 20 years or so? And how do we just try them again? And maybe they were the thing that we just didn't get it the first time around.
Interesting.
So I'll just go a little bit on that. I mean, we have customers that kind of go the whole spectrum, still very, very early in on maybe just agile development, not even towards DevOps yet, right? And then all the way through to customers like Cody's talking about here, where they're on to the cloud native technologies, moving to the cloud or all in on the cloud. It really does cross the entire spectrum. So, I mean, security is, as I said earlier, a really integral part of working with all these customers and trying to work with them to get it introduced as earlier as possible. But it's really, there's lots of components, right? I mean, it's not easy. There are lots of components. It's not just about securing your software, the whatever thousands of lines of code you build, right? It's securing the open source products that you have included with it. It's securing your repositories. It's securing your secrets. I mean, there's so many different components with it that I think that's where lots of organizations struggle with.
Interesting. Okay, David, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that, with the modern software supply chain where organizations, as mentioned here, deliver services as images or containers or microservices can be shipped as serverless functions, and it's all being automated. You have to automate your security checks and to the extent possible, even your remediation. You just can't cope with the speed of this modern software supply chain. And we're seeing so many customers going this way, different maturity levels, but I mean, we're already seeing customers shipping software 10 times a day, delivering updates to production because all of their software supply chain is automated. And I'm sure that we're going to see more and more of that happening. And definitely DevSecOps and automation must take place in these types of organizations. Otherwise, they can't deliver software so fast.
Yeah, it's really, we're definitely moving toward that, that kind of serverless world where security is definitely the more of a starting point, if you will, than an afterthought. And that's, kind of a good seg into our next kind of topic, if you will, which is, how did we get where we are? How did the attitudes kind of change between security? It's kind of a pain in the butt. We don't really want to do it, but we have to meet compliance or whatever. And then now it's, oh my God, security has to be a part of the conversation from the get-go. And I know that obviously with the increased amount of threats that are out there now, and the just it's a constant barrage of cyber attacks that are happening and hackers getting into the network, and you have to make sure that your application and your security or your software systems are as secure as possible. So, but do you guys see this as more of an evolution for DevSecOps, or was it something that just kind of like happened kind of an almost overnight occurrence where people, there's like one big awakening, if you will? I don't care who starts it.
I can chime in a little bit. I mean, I've been later to security, but like when I was working in mining, like for me, that whole Stuxnet thing, the industrial control systems, that really that for me kind of realized like this is dangerous, this is real, this is cybersecurity. And I think as far as attitudes, we've gotten a lot better about security. I mean, internally, password managers is a much more common term I'm hearing. In general, there's more user-friendly security products. Security is, at least in our organization, definitely not an afterthought. Like as a security company, it's why we make money. So we're also very conscientious about how we secure it, because like from a brand reputation, it's pretty high up there versus some other industry segments. And I think people are getting better at being able to shift left. So shifting left also involved like that coding piece I was talking about. I mean, coding resources are available now. Python's relatively easy to learn. There's online resources, things like that, where even shifting left before as a security analyst, that was nearly impossible time. Like, you want me to go back to school for 4 years, get a computer science degree, and then go will shift left? No, I can go try to learn some scripting, and I can hang out with engineering group. Like, oh, I kind of get this. And now I think it's really possible for people to shift left. So I think it was sort of a combination of things that contributed to that, where we're able to have better attitudes, whereas before it was a lot bigger of a struggle to shift your attitude towards thinking about security first.
So do you guys, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I mean, I wish I knew this question was coming up later in here, since I talked about what I thought. I do think it's an evolution, like a natural trend. But yeah, to go on what Cody was just saying, I spent a couple weeks ago, I got to go out to Enterprise Forum that was held by Gene Kim. And there was a group of just DevOps thought leaders and really some industry trailblazers that really, been working with DevOps for quite a few years. Security was the number one topic on mind. So I mean, it really is the hot topic now, and I think the shift left movement is just the beginning, right? We got tools now that can do it much better, but there's still more to be done. And I think David started a little bit on it earlier when he was talking about automation, right? It all needs to be automated. It needs to be automated to execute, but we also needed automated ways to collect all of that data. It's really about the data, right? So that we can make that data available to everybody, if it's for reporting, if it's for compliance, it's for auditability. It really needs to be all unified at some point, all this data, because there's so many different tool sets that are crossing, all these different, where security exists, or we call them control points, right? All the different control points throughout your release process, and collect that data and just make the data available. So I still think there are ways, more evolution that needs to take place moving forward that's going to build upon what we're already seeing today. But it's certainly top of mind, and everybody's looking at ways of introducing it into their environment at some level, into their DevOps process.
All right, great.
Can
So
I add to that?
David. Sure,
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, just one quick comment. So yeah, I mean, we do see it happening. We do see it happening in full speed. And depending on the maturity level of an organization, we see our customers being able to shift left their security gates. Some of them start with the CI, but we also already see customers doing security gates on the repository, so they scan every commit or every pull request. The more mature customers even break builds or even break the merges into the master branch in the repository. And we even have customers who do that on the IDE level. So during the code development time, they already get some security warnings on using unsecured code, either vulnerable open source dependencies or some known attacks that can happen on the lines of code that you just added. So we're going to see a lot of going on in that direction, on shifting left those endeavors and being able to automate and putting the security gates as closer as possible to the dev teams.
All right, great. That's that's really an important point, because actually the next slide kind of talks about some of the challenges that a lot of organizations, or many organizations, are kind of dealing with in implementing DevSecOps. And one of the questions is kind of, where does it fit into the software development lifecycle, and how do you get it into the tool chain? And I think that may be one area where a lot of companies are struggling. They just don't know how far left they need to shift. I think also, we've got some issues with developers kind of, they just don't want to have to take on security. It's just one more thing they have to deal with in their mind. And so, I'm interested in hearing from you guys what you're hearing from your customers as far as what they're facing when it comes to implementing DevSecOps. What challenges are top of mind for them? And David, why don't you go ahead and start us with this one?
Thank you. Yeah. So it's a very important topic, and this is something we're actually working on very rigidly on supporting the shift left efforts for resolving security issues. So what we see is that, and we always ask this in conferences, and we had a huge developer survey last year. And I always ask, when there's a developer conference, how many of you like developing cool code and using the latest programming languages and design patterns? Then they all raise their hands, and then ask them, how many of you like resolving security issues? Then you see one or two, guys that kind of want to raise their hands, but they look around to see if they're not the only ones. It's just not interesting. And that's, again, they need to ship their software, they need to ship it fast without bugs. And that's kind of, something to add on top of that. So I think that the key relies on being able to prioritize the security vulnerabilities correctly, which means that you need to reduce the load on the dev teams. And when we install our product, you would see hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities just, when you first scan the code. So it's just something that's not manageable. So you have to have the means to actually communicate to the developers the vulnerabilities that matter, and then you start prioritizing them by different criteria, by the code that actually is being used by your application, and by the CVSS score and severity, and what are the most critical apps, and so on. And by average, by the way, our numbers indicate that developers spend 15 hours a month resolving security issues. So that's a lot. It's like almost 2 days of work a month. And if you reduce this number and to a manageable time, like 3-4 hours a month, then you make it easier on them. And then if you also provide them with the tools in their own natural environment, integrated into their repository, into their IDE, into their browser, without the need to being required to read emails coming from the security analysts, or being required to log into security tools, then you made it much smoother and easier on them to support these efforts. And I believe these are the challenges, and the ways to actually address these challenges is to first prioritize the vulnerabilities that matter, and then reduce the load on the developers. And second is to provide them with the tools in their own natural environment, and if possible, also give them all the remediation facilities. So if you can also facilitate the remediation by just a click of a button, or by giving them the tools to actually change their code to remediate that would make it easier on them. They'll cooperate better.
All right, great. Cody, what are you seeing? What are your customers telling you some of the challenges that they're facing?
I think generally the attitude is more positive. Like most developers, it is true it's like one more thing to do, but if it's one more thing to do on top of what they already do, that's where they really have the problem. It's like, you're giving me extra workload for a security thing. Like that is a big deal. Like some of these are very, sort of mentally intensive tasks, and they're things that, like, they're very, it's mentally taxing when you go through a deploy where you're fixing security bugs, and you wonder, like, could I potentially introduce a new one? Will this break everything? Like, it's a very weird thing. And I think that's what the securities team job is to do, is not only like identify things and help them fix them, but alleviate sort of that top-down view of how security is looked at. Is it just one more thing to do on top of everything, or is it something that they account for every release cycle? Do they have points and resources dedicated to this? And when you take it from that sort of approach, the culture on the team will be much more conducive to fixing things like that. And you won't have to fit yourself in as a security person. They'll come to you for consultation because you're helping them get their job done, helping them get the tasks done. When they get to a security task, they come to you because you're easy to work with. And so those are some of the things I think security people have been traditionally bad at, is being easy to work with and being very helpful. At least when I got started, it was much more throw the report over the wall and hope for the best.
Right,
and then at the end of the year, when we have a review, if you guys don't knock everything off, I'll call the CISO on you. I don't know. It was very it's sort of elementary, and it's just like, I just think our mindsets are starting to change a lot. And I think organizations have shown more positive. But if you have an organization where they've been working 10, 20 years in the same position, same culture, like that's going to be a battle to change it. But there are definite benefits and very, very few detriments towards moving sort of that type of approach to everything. And yeah, traditional security tools, I've used a lot of the traditional ones. They're not that great, and I've just moved much more towards like scripting and like automating things, and when appropriate, hiring commercial vendors to actually handle security for us. There's a lot of vendors out there. Security market is blowing up. I think there's a lot of cool plays on different things that you could use help with. It's just about finding that right value and that right fit for a tool in your environment. I think everyone's is a little bit different, and that's where the challenges are. Is there's thousands of I shouldn't say thousands. There's a lot of best practices, and sometimes they kind of conflict. And I think like people's interpretation of like religious texts varies. So they kind of wonder like, no, that's not the spirit of DevOps I'm talking about. It's like, well, now we're getting to like a weird conversation. I think that's where the challenges are, is when it gets a little bit too philosophical. And it's like, well, let's just really get some things done rather than talking about it and aggregating all this data and doing that. Let's make decisions that solve problems. If you're not solving a problem by what you're doing, you're probably wasting your time.
That's a good point. And Dan, I'd like to get your perspective too, from somebody who's kind of more DevOps focused than security focused. Not just what your customers are saying, but also maybe how they view security, because I've heard it time and time again that security has traditionally been thought of as the department of no. So, is that a barrier for some of your customers as they, when they're faced with having to add the sec into DevSecOps, is that kind of a mental thing for them to kind of have to get past beyond, get beyond the security is such a pain in the what that they just don't even want to have to deal with it.
Yeah, I'll even go back to my development days. I mean, that was the evil side of the building when our code actually went over to security and they started testing it, and so help it if you had one of the security guys walk into your cube, and say that this needs to be fixed and so forth. But yeah, yes, we see it. I mean, security is definitely one of the bottlenecks or roadblocks that really slows down adoption, without a doubt. And I think as technology continues to get better and better, we're going to ease that, putting less of the burden on the developer. Right now, with tools that we can automate as part of that process. So that's helped at least getting the insertion points. But the pain in the beginning is the problem, right? Because they haven't done this before. So you're introducing a new process, and most likely you're going to have to address a lot of issues right in the beginning. But once you get past that, then it should be just the maintaining level afterwards, right? So now we're starting to run all of these tests, and it's really, where does it fit in the software development lifecycle? I mean, it's all over the place, right? Depending on what tool. Is it static testing? Is it dynamic testing? Is it runtime, components and so forth? It really crosses the stream. So I think in talking to customers, it's really like, you've got to work through this. This is it's hard. We need to get it introduced into the pipeline. And as you start to make it more standard, so it's every release, right? Every release that you run, it's just built into it as automation. The amount of changes hopefully will start to go down. And yes, your developers are going to have to play a part early on in this process, as they even get better at learning the types of things that need to be protected, right? Because again, this is new for a lot of developers. They'll start to get better at it. But it is a cultural change. It's one of the, I think, biggest blockers for adoption in DevOps right now. But again, I think we're getting better.
Yeah, so I see it as kind of an attitudinal thing, but also an educational thing, because to your point, it's all over the tool chain. And I think a lot of it has to do with understanding exactly what security solution is going to be best for whatever project you're working on, because it's going to be different for different projects. So I wonder if there needs to be a certain amount of education that happens on the part of the vendor to help its customers kind of understand the security's role in that software development lifecycle for that particular project. I mean, is that something that start with you, Dan? Is that something that you think the vendor should take on, and is that kind of a one conversation, or is that kind of an ongoing process for these guys and gals?
Yeah, I certainly think it's an ongoing process. I think any type of discussion, I mean, it's almost like you need a reference architecture, right? A reference architecture that can like list out all the different security vulnerability points within your release process and the types of tools that can address each and every one of them. Because there's a lot. You know, I was jotting down like right before we got on this call today. I just was taking a look at, you know, you have your DevOps tool state of the tool set, right? And we have our periodic here at ZBO Labs, right? And we break down just DevOps itself into like 10 and 14 different categories, but then we get into security tools, right? And we don't really break down the different types of security tools. And I was just thinking out loud, and I started jotting it down, and I was like, okay, we have version control, unit test, DAS, IaaS, SCA, WAF, RAS, container management, license, and secrets. All these different types of tools that we need to introduce into the pipeline. I think a lot of organizations don't know where to start. So I completely agree that education is one way to address it. But I do wonder, just thinking out loud right now, is, you know, some good reference architectures or guidance for these organizations to know where to start and how to introduce across all these different security tool sets that are part of the DevOps tool chain.
Yeah, I agree. I think a reference architecture would be a great thing, definitely. So, okay, Cody, David, any thoughts on that, or shall we just keep moving along here?
I did want to plug real quick. Actually, OWASP does have an AppSec pipeline architecture. It's really cool. It's a reference one. It's put together by Matt Tesaro. It's a really great sort of layout of automating it. I think he references like a few open source like Rundeck or something like that, and then how to automate DAS and SaaS tools, and then like some other one for like cataloging all those vulnerabilities. So there's a few sort of initiatives towards that, but I think that it doesn't apply to every organization. So it's a little bit generalized, and it's hard to fit that into a lot. So I think we could, as an industry, do better at making reference architectures that are, you know, more approachable for different types of industries.
All right, great. David, any thoughts, or shall we just keep moving?
Yeah, just one quick point. I think that education reference architectures are very important for the security teams and DevOps. For the developers themselves, I mean, from our experience, they'd like to learn whatever they want at the time they want. So, I mean, from interviewing hundreds of developers, we found out that if you embed the learning or testing inside their environment, they'll cooperate much better and they like it better. So, you know, having them go through an online training or like a course or something just doesn't work with the modern dev teams. They have to have these tools inside their, you know, IDEs and repositories and inline their processes, and they'll cooperate better. So that's my point about education.
All right, great. Well, we have, gosh, we're almost at quarter to the top of the hour, and we still have two topics I want to go over real quick. So we'll just dive right on ahead. The old open source versus proprietary argument, which is better, and what are some of the considerations? And I know some of this has to do with the open source libraries. You know, our open source libraries, they can be challenging, but why? I mean, what is about the open source libraries beyond, you know, the obvious fact that they could introduce vulnerabilities by not keeping the source code updated, things of that nature. Is that really, I mean, I know it's a huge problem, but is that the biggest problem with using these open source libraries? And also, when we're talking about using open source libraries, what can organizations do to make sure that they do keep themselves as secure as possible using open source libraries? So, Cody, let's start this with you, and then I'd like to hear from David.
Yeah, so using open source like internally, like that's never going to really go away. And I think David is actually going to answer this one a lot better. But SCA tools are really great at this sort of this solution. It's finding the ones you're using, cataloging them, find what vulnerabilities have. And then I don't think there really is a debate open source versus proprietary. It's obvious that you're going to get you're not going to have a support contract with open source. If you put in a pull request, it might or might not get accepted. And then there's a certain responsibility I think organizations have been sloughing off for a while, is that if you use a ton of open source libraries, contribute back, like make that part of the budget. I don't really get that you build like entire profitable companies and then you basically abandon these huge open source libraries. Like there's tons of unmaintained libraries that support big parts of the internet. So for me, that's a really strange trade-off that I think people make. Is it's like it's free, it's easy, it's great to use, but like you also got to cycle back and contribute just a little bit. And even if you can't, maybe donate some money or something. And on the proprietary side, like there are great proprietary solutions, and they're usually custom catered for some of their early customers or their big paying customers. And I think that's something that I'd encourage more companies to do as well, is to try out new tools. There is an investment on your side. You have to try them out. You have to use them. But if you get good at that whole process of basically doing an MVP internally or a POC and get really good about testing these things and cutting it off when it doesn't make sense to move forward, you get a good experience for these new companies where you can kind of cater the direction it's moving. And so maybe if something doesn't fit what you need it today, it could fit very well in like a year or two if you're one of their first and early customers and constantly providing feedback. So I think there is sort of this ownership on both sides, that if you are a customer of a commercial product, your feedback matters, your tickets matter, even if something's not broken, like keep that feedback loop going. Same on the open source side, contribute back to it, put in feature requests, and if you put in a bug, sometimes realize that's one person maybe in their kitchen that maintains this library. Like be very conscientious of that and how difficult something like that is to do.
All right, great. David, what are your thoughts?
This is our sweet spot. So I don't think there's better or worse. It's just a different animal. So proprietary code, from the application security perspective, there's a lot of great tools to scan your code, either statically, dynamically, or interactively, which are the modern tools. But it's a different phase in the software development lifecycle. It usually takes a lot more time than open source scanning. So it's something that you can't really run continuously in your pipeline. Open source scanning is much more accurate because it's based on checksum. So when you have an open source library, there's only one checksum. If you used it the way all the other thousands or dozens of thousands of other organizations used it, then you have the same library, and the vulnerabilities are reported publicly per library. So you have a known set of vulnerabilities per an open source component. And the good news about it is that because it's maintained by the community, more than 80% of the known vulnerabilities are also published together with the corresponding fix. So it's more actionable than proprietary code when it comes to remediating security issues. But it's a different animal. You can run it anywhere in the pipeline. It's much more accurate. There's a lot less false positive. It's an easier way to start with, because you don't have to run long-lasting security checks, and sift through thousands of different findings that are all theoretical, because here you have the known vulnerabilities reported by the community, and if you do it right, it's very easy to implement. So it's not that there's a good or bad. You need to have both in place, but they fit into different phases in the pipeline, and they provide different types of results and different types of remediation capabilities.
All right, Great. Dan, you have any quick thoughts you want to, or shall we just move on?
Yeah, I maybe two-second thoughts on there, right? So, I mean, open source is, I mean, it's been vital to DevOps, right? I mean, we see Jenkins and what it's done and the adoption that it created. When I look at open source and I talk to customers about it, I mean, open source solve a solution for customers, and they're usually a point solution most of the time, but they're also for skilled users, right? They're designed for skilled users who can take it and can adapt it. So developers, right, that have that mindset. It's not, if you're going to have a solution that's going to, the ease of use is important, or if you need a UI so you can share that data or processes with across the organization, where it I think goes outside of that open source framework.
Okay. All right, great. Last topic, and then we'll get into, hopefully we'll have a time for a question or two at the end. This is something that's been kind of coming up in conversations a lot lately, which is, how can we do DevSecOp and cloud native? And Cody, to your point, your serverless point earlier, I think this is definitely the time to talk about that. But there are certain challenges that to DevSecOps that containers and microservices and those frameworks represent, or those ways of development offer up. So at the very least, it's just, when we're talking about containers, the fact that they are ephemeral, that they're spinning up and coming down, and it's kind of hard to, it's like herding cats, I think. So, what are some of the things that you guys are seeing in this cloud native space that are kind of particular to that space that really is kind of a challenge for DevSecOps in that space? Cody, if you want to go ahead and start.
Yeah. So the most common complaint I've heard is around observability and logging. So you're right now limited to whatever really platform you choose. So there are the most popular right now by far is Lambda. And it's just because along with deploying in that microservice, you get tons of other services to use. And really that's all that plays in there. There's other offerings. One more ones I like to point to is a company called ZBO, and you can actually define your own Docker image that you want to run. And so each container that I want to run, it'll still have the same, billing per request sort of thing, but you can control the environment that it's run in. And so I think as different vendors kind of approach it, really it's just an opinionated container deployment framework is all it is. I think James Wickett commonly referred to that. He used to work at our head of research, was that it's an opinionated way to deploy containers. And so just like Kubernetes was too complicated, vendors saw the value in it and then just absorbed that and then put a nice UI in front of it. And as more do it, they'll have more offerings and more connective services. But I encourage people to check out some of the other ones. If you're doing very simple REST API sort of CRUD things, you don't need DynamoDB, you don't need a ton of stuff that AWS has. You can sort of build that on your own and then decide if you want to move in that direction. And then you obviously have that sort of vendor lock-in. If they make changes to fundamentally how things run, from a business perspective, that could become a big risk. They could basically destroy your business just by changing maybe some underlying things. Hopefully you catch up. But if you start to design things around the way that they work, you run into really weird issues when a vendor changes how the underlying infrastructure works. And so I think you'll see more companies exploring that sort of methodology. Do we deploy in a vendor environment where all of our services are run that way? Do we still host some things on premise? Do we want to control our own containers and be responsible for those? So that's where security is going to be really confused. They don't know, make a decision, you guys, which way you're going to go, where do we play in? Where's the logging going to go? How am I going to check on this stuff? From a forensic perspective, what do I do if there's an employee doing something? Get to these really weird questions. I think that's where security is going to struggle the most with is if we thought DevOps was a trend and it's not one that we caught up with and we're just now catching up on, serverless is getting adopted at a significantly higher rate, I think. And I think more companies are paying attention to it. It's very popular. You're going to see iterations on it AWS Fargate. They have one called Firecracker, and it's basically an always live microservice, which is just a web server. And so I think as they move, security is going to have a lot of trouble just understanding how that stuff works. So it is a big change, and it's very opinionated how the vendor works it. So security, approaching that, it's a whole new tool set. And even some of the assumptions that we have are going to be broken, but I think in a good way. Like the fact that somebody can basically break into a serverless application, be given free reign, and it's all limit. Their impact is limited to what that IAM credential is, what they're assigned as a role. That's huge, and being able to do that at scale, that's a big step for security. And I think organizations will get better at using these and understanding how to integrate them into their own environments.
Okay. Great. We're about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, so I want to give Dan and David just a minute to add on if you have something to say about the DevOps and cloud native topic. David, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yeah, I'll be quick. So I mean, securing cloud native environments and serverless and containers is a challenge, because it's like doing application security without the access to the actual components that comprise the apps. You don't have access to the code. So what you have to do is you have to understand the packages or the ingredients that comprise the serverless function or container, and you have to maintain that inventory externally, because they are ephemeral by nature. And what happens if you're safe and all of a sudden there's a new security vulnerability affecting some of your images? Then you have to understand the impact of which images are affected, and what are the list of chain of images. Maybe if it was the base image and there's a lot more images affected. So you have to think a little bit differently, work with what you have, because you don't have access to the actual code, and be able to detect things quickly and alert on the components that are actually being affected.
Okay, great. Dan, any thoughts?
Yeah, even quicker than David there. So yeah, I mean, it's changing, right? Everything's being broken down into smaller and smaller components. Where you do that testing, right? You're obviously going to do some testing early on in the development process, and it's got to be protected early on there. And yeah, I think, back to evolution of DevOps, right? It's changing, and we're going to have to come up with newer and better ways to protect the microservices and serverless compute. So where that goes, I think we're still going to find out.
Okay, it's work in progress, right? Just like DevOps, as you said.
Exactly.
So, awesome. All right, great. Great. At this point, I want to go ahead and just open it up for like one quick question, because that's all the time we have for. So let's see. How can where to go? Okay. How can privileged access management be accomplished in DevSecOps toolchain for cloud-hosted applications? So yeah, whoever wants to answer that one, hopefully we can get that one answered quickly.
I know internally we're moving to the whole kind of zero trust model. So that's like the certificate-based laptop that's not worrying about credentials. It's sort of the device that has access to it. Very easy to deprovision and provision people. And then also, I think Netflix has two great tools. I'll reference a Repo Kid. That one's really interesting because it basically will repossess some of the AWS IAM credentials that people have been given based off what they have actually used. And so, like, I think with AWS, I mean, they didn't really revolutionize it, but having an API that you can automate like that and go against and say, like, if you haven't used this privilege that we have, this very granular, like delete S3 object only on, something like that. If you haven't used that in the last 3 months, we're just going to take it away, and then you can come back to us if you ever need it. And so, like, reducing it down to that really least privilege principle in practice is very, very hard to do. And when I've actually tried to approach those things, it disrupts the business. And like, well, I don't know what that group is because this guy was doing something over the weekend that was on another team. And so I don't really know where to deal with that. There's no exclusion in the tool we use. So I think dealing with that, look to open source, look to big companies. I shouldn't say not like Netflix, but similar companies are very forward thinking about developing their own security tools, because there are some great ones out there. And then with any kind of vendor that you do happen to use, having an API to access makes it a lot easier. Okta, Duo, anything like that. Look towards automation of repealing and pulling back credentials when you need to. Have a nice onboarding and offboarding process. Have it all pieced together. And I think that's the best way to manage those sort of things is, yeah, keep it as least privileged as possible and always keep it running and very, very dynamic and fluid with the organization's changes.
Okay. All right. Guys, unfortunately, we're a minute to the top of the hour, so we do need to close out the Q&A session. If we didn't get to your question, which probably we didn't, my apologies, but know that all of our panelists will be getting a copy of the questions, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. It's 2 o'clock Eastern, but I do want to real quick do the winners, the gift card winner drawing. So our winners today are Brent Sargent, congratulations Brent, Martin Sirkin, congratulations Martin, and Tom Witten. Congratulations, Tom. Want to remind the audience also that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to listen to it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. We'll be sending out an email that contains a link to the webinar on demand. You'll also be getting a link to that ebook that I mentioned earlier today. The webinar is also going to be on the DevOps.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it will be right there. Gentlemen, Dan, David, and Cody, thank you so much for your time today. Great stuff, fascinating conversation. So thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Charlene.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah,
All right,
good to meet you all.
All right, want to thank the audience also for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.